And so there really is this remarkable intimacy that's created where people admit stuff on Risk that really is jaw-dropping sometimes.
This is your Daily Detroit for July 9th, 2019. I'm Jer Stays. Risk, in my humble opinion, is one of the best storytelling podcasts out there. For about a decade now, the show has shared the true stories of people from across the nation. But here's the kicker. They're told without fear. They're without the filter that most people tend to apply when they're in public. And that makes the stories really great to listen to. Because real life, it's a trip. It's at times heartfelt, at times risqué. Sometimes the topics are difficult, but most often, and this is really the magic, there's a hilarity that only something from real life can provide. The Risk show is coming to the Magic Bag in Ferndale on August 15th. So ahead of that, I thought we'd chat with comedian and ringmaster of the Risk podcast, Kevin Allison. He joins me via the power of the internet from Brooklyn right after this. Daily Detroit is brought to you in part by Repurpose. That's where you can get hired by Detroit's best startups and companies. Repurpose connects top talent like you with purpose-driven companies based on values, experience, and culture fit. Join their talent community at repurpose.co. That's repurpose.co. So we started off talking about storytelling and podcasting.
On Risk, what we've found, it's a storytelling podcast, but what separates us from some of the other storytelling shows is the whole idea that here is a show where you can be honest and raw and revealing and intimate and uncensored in a way that it might not occur to you to be if you were on, say, National Public Radio or some bigger format. And there really is like an intimacy that podcasts create, because part of it is just the pure, raw psychological feel of that you're right there in someone's ears. Most people listen to podcasts in earbuds, so it almost feels like someone is right there next to you speaking into your ear. And what we've found is that, some of our storytellers we'll also make video of some of the stuff that we do at our live shows sometimes. And some of our storytellers will be like, oh, yeah, but could you not put that on YouTube? It's just they trust more the feeling of, okay, someone who's listening to me with earbuds in their ears is kind of coming to this with more of their attention and more of their personal commitment to the show that they're listening to. And so there really is this remarkable intimacy that's created where people admit stuff on Risk that really is jaw-dropping sometimes. It can get it can feel like you're in the middle of a therapy session sometimes, and it's very cathartic that way.
Well, it reminds me of something that I heard. I think it's a media theory point. The whole idea of the concept of the size of the room. And you want the room, you can say certain things in a room that's a certain size, right? So if your room is millions of people or perceived to be millions of people that are driving by or not really participating, what you would say in there is different than a room of 100 people or a room of 4 people that are around a table. And that really affects how things are and how the conversation goes. And one of the powers of podcasting, I think, is that no matter how big the downloads get, the room stays small. And that is magic. That's so hard. The difference between broadcast and regular television, because I've worked in broadcast TV. We do occasional segments for public television here at Daily Detroit. For us, it's a huge difference of versus TV versus even broadcast radio. The podcast keeps the room small, and that creates great conversations.
Oh, absolutely. People who listen to Risk feel like they're, kind of dipping into a community. There's very much a communal feel to the Risk audience, like most of our stories come from people who listen to the podcast and hear me saying, hey, Detroit, we're coming to town. Pitch us your stories. And because those people have listened to the podcast and they've heard, oh my gosh, that person was able to share about how insane it was the night that they lost their virginity when they were on LSD, or holy cow, that person, was molested as a child and now they have all these memories of it that they want to share. Like, maybe I can share some of the most extraordinary things that have happened to me too. And so people pitch us, and some of the people that perform on Risk are, extremely well-known people like Trevor Noah or Sarah Silverman. But a lot of the people that come and share stories on the show, most of the people who share stories on the show, really don't have all that much experience on stage. We've had people do the show before that have never stepped foot on a stage before in their life,
Well, that makes me think, stories, I listen to the podcast. I've also read parts of the book. I don't think stories necessarily need to be long either to have impact and resonate. I mean, one of my favorite stories, I think, from the book is The Duel by Lily Taylor. And I think, and it's this crazy vignette to most people, right? With the idea of, and if you haven't read the book, I encourage people to do. This particular story is on page 120, is that this father deals with manic depression, and there's some form of basically challenging, the kid to a knife fight. And that is a crazy story. But to me, it was oddly comforting. And it's comforting because I dealt with a lot of those issues myself with my dad, right? And so it felt, as strange as that might sound, it felt really comforting. Like, wow, somebody else has dealt with this crazy thing that I don't tell many people about, because it just blows people's circuits if you share that kind of thing sometimes. But in the book, in the podcast, it feels like you can do that. Do you ever hear those kind of like reverb experiences where people are like, well, I saw this, so I feel like I can share my story, or I can resonate with that?
Constantly. We get emails on, almost a daily basis where someone will say, for example, like we went to Austin, Texas a couple of years ago, and a married couple came up to me afterwards and they said, we had been married for 15 years. We had decided to get divorced, and we were beginning, the long process of ending things and all that, when we both heard these Risk episodes where people were telling their kinky stories, their stories about explorations of sexual fetishes and BDSM and all that sort of thing. And in the process, we started sharing these episodes with each other, and we both realized, oh my gosh, we've both been in the closet our entire lives, to ourselves and to each other, about the fact that we're kinky. And so they said that, having listened to these stories, they started to dare to try stuff with each other. And they're like, and now we have sex every day and we've kept the marriage alive. I was like, holy cow. Yeah, I once heard from a young lady, she emailed me. She was not yet out of high school. She was like a junior or a senior in high school. And several months prior to emailing me, she had been raped. And she said, I just need you guys to know that I think that this whole experience would have been so much more traumatic for me, and I would have been at so much more of a loss. I would have lost years of not knowing how to deal with what I've just been through if I hadn't heard other women share their stories on the podcast and be able to say, holy cow, people do live through this. People do grow stronger from how they handle it. I need to reach out for help, et cetera, et cetera. So we get those kind of emails all the time where people feel like the vicarious experience that they've had from listening to the podcast informs some of their own philosophies or some of their own like approaches to their own life experiences, for sure.
You know, this makes me think a little bit about process. So, what are you looking for when you're thinking about these stories that you're going to pick for the show, for inclusion in things? What are some of the things that you're looking for as kind of the building blocks for a story, and kind of how do you encourage people to kind of get to that, right? Because I feel like risk is at the top of a process pyramid of, okay, well, this is the beginning of the story. This is the thing that happened to me. And then eventually it gets to risk. But I feel like risk is the result of a lot of work by a lot of people with themselves to get there. Can you kind of shed a little bit on that process?
Yeah, the place where we ask people to start brainstorming is to try to zero in on exact moments, specific incidences where, if you can remember the time of day, the location you were at, when you were feeling the most emotion. So, risk stories run the gamut. Some are hilarious, some are, love stories, some are terrifying, they're all over the spectrum. But we always encourage people, think of the time when you were most giddy or when you were most bewildered or whatever it might be. And see if you can zero in on a few particular incidences and then start asking yourself some questions like, how did I end up there that day? What was going on earlier in that week? Or wait, what? I wonder why that person did make that suggestion to me. It's very much kind of like therapy in that you don't realize how much of these little things that actually really continue to resonate in your emotional history. When you go back and you start filling in some of the details, you start to understand them better and you can make new sense out of your own experiences that way. So yeah, we ask people to send us some ideas for some scenes of some actual moments they've lived through. And then we start asking them all those contextual questions like, ooh, it sounds like how your mother felt about this meant a hell of a lot to you. So can you tell us a little bit about what else was going on between you and your mother that summer? Those kind of things really help people to start to shape it into a story that makes emotional sense.
Yeah, that shaping I think is really valuable. I think a lot of people try to tell a story 100% by themselves, and I think it's really good to have kind of a sounding board
my gosh.
For it.
I've been teaching storytelling for almost 10 years now, but I still require people to help me out with my stories. Like I have a therapist, and I will literally come into my therapist with a first draft of a story to kind of read through and then pause and then have him ask me questions. But I also have a writing coach that I sometimes see. And here on Risk, we have a whole staff full of story coaches to help people prepare for the show. So yeah, no, I think that it's invaluable for even the most experienced writer to, put a first draft out there and then start hearing how it's resonating with people or questions that people have, because that you can often unpack things that you didn't even realize were there based on people's reactions.
One of the decisions about the Risk podcast that I find fascinating, and cards on table as a podcast producer myself, is the decision to do a lot of this live and in front of a studio audience. What do you think that brings to the table? And I mean, so many podcasts are done in studios. If you think about the high polished stuff that, say, Gimlet does and the great storyteller that Alex Bloomberg is and other folks, that stuff is never in front of the hot audience. But the Risk podcast, so often it feels like the audience is part of the storytelling.
Yeah, it's fascinating. We do radio style stories at times, but the majority of what we do are live in front of an audience. So We find the radio stories just harder to produce because they're more time consuming. Music and sound design get involved. And we often will reserve the radio style stories for the longer stories. If a person wants to share something that's going to take an hour or an hour and a half to share, and might get especially intimate, and we're worried that that person might break down or something like that, then they're comfortable enough to do that with me in my apartment in Brooklyn. But most, 85% of Risk stories are live in front of an audience at our shows. And there, what's really interesting, we always tell people, remember, you're in a conversation here. It's true, it's just you on stage and people aren't talking back to you. But we want you to look into people's eyes, and we want you to acknowledge that, we're here live in this moment and anything could happen. There should be a certain amount of going with the flow of the energy in the room. And that is incredibly invigorating. I mean, we've had all kinds of disasters at Risk shows, where someone was so nervous that they got too drunk to tell their story. Or we've had several occasions where people in the audience got so disturbed by stories that they fainted, and we had to call the EMTs and all that kind of thing. So there's very much this is live theater, anything can happen at Risk shows. People always comment that as much as they love the intimacy of the podcast, that there is something more intense. There's just something more riveting and dynamic about being there in the room with that person looking right at you and sharing their story. So it's definitely I always tell the storytellers, you are going to be a nervous wreck, most likely, when you do the show. But use that nervousness to just help you be more alert and connected to the people you're speaking to. Think of it almost like you're actually just telling friends at a bar or in a coffee shop or in your living room or whatever, these intensely personal things that you're sharing. And it usually creates this very electric feeling. One of the things that's very interesting, you just said, the importance of the live audience, is that people reacting to Risk online will often react to what the audience did. People will be like, well, I got really angry to hear the audience laughing at that particular moment. It'll often be a nervous laugh that the audience did or something like that. And I always say, well, there's nothing we can do about the way that what happens in the rest of. We can give lots of guidance to the storytellers, but there's only so much we can do to the way that people in the room react.
Well, isn't that kind of the power of a conversation? I mean, I know someone might not think of a live event as a conversation, but in a lot of ways it is. And when you have a conversation, multiple people can take multiple things from it. And I feel kind of like the future of media is more of that conversation. If you look at what people are into, the rise of podcasting, the types of television that do well from a high editorial point of view, it's more of a conversation where there's multiple parts, where, like in your case, there's the conversation between the audience and the performer and the person who's reacting it. And I think that's like a real sea change, and it requires like a different approach to production.
Yeah, it's fascinating. People are often very engaged with the whole idea of, is Risk changing over time because of cultural changes in the national discourse, And as the guy who's directed the show, for almost 10 years now, there are some ways that I can see that happening, and there are some ways where I might be oblivious to parts of that happening. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of amazing to me that we'll have like men's rights people or Trump voters or people engaging, online with us where they're like, oh, I feel like the show has become to this or to that in the points of views that the storytellers are presenting. And what I always say to people is, well, I mean, we take what is pitched to us and we just encourage each individual to speak as directly to their own personal interpretations of their lives as they can. We're not necessarily endorsing or promoting any point of view. What we're trying to do is give people a chance to express themselves as honestly as they can. So it's fascinating to see how the conversation, goes from people listening to the podcast to people talking about the podcast on Facebook or other places.
Well, and that online discussion is so different than a conversation in person, I think, because people, they see the thing, it kind of floats by in their stream, and then they react to it from their perspective and how they're feeling about their life. Like so often, like our Facebook page, and I don't mean this to brag, I mean this to give context because there's a lot of folks on it. When something really hits, there's nearly 70,000 people on that Facebook page. And when something really hits, it's the comments are so often not about the actual piece, because so often, and I thought it was just me, but like calling around like to different friends and things, like people just don't read anymore. And so they see the thing and then they react quickly in regards to how they feel about the thing. And it's almost like telling their story.
Oh, absolutely. I think that Twitter, Facebook, even Instagram they encourage people to prejudge things. They encourage like these instant knee-jerk reactions. It's funny when people type out arguments, they're often arguing with archetypes in their own head rather than whoever the comment is addressed to, because often they won't even know who the person on the other line, on the other end of the keyboard is. And that's one of the reasons I value the audio podcast so much, is that for anywhere from 15 minutes, or like you said, in the case of that Lily Taylor story, just 5 minutes, or sometimes 90 minutes, you can hear a person just really speak from their own heart with their own voice and go into great detail about an actual experience they've had. There's that famous saying that Mr. Rogers used to carry around with him, you can learn to love anyone once you've heard their story. And so that is a part of it that it takes you away from that instant knee jerk, here's a prepackaged little idea thing. And it takes you into, here's an actual like personality being themselves and really laying out for you a series of feelings and thoughts that they had about their life experiences.
Yeah, that's a funny thing about all this. It's almost like the podcast and other things create an in-person conversation with somebody that you've never met.
Yeah. Well, it's fascinating because, I've told a lot of stories on Risk myself. And, we have this Patreon where, fans of the show can help support the show financially, and we give them all kinds of bonus material there. And one of the bonus materials is that once a week, I'll just sit in front of a microphone and kind of journal out loud to the audience. And those can get like the last one I put up, I surprised myself and broke down crying in the middle of what I was talking about. Like it's so a lot of the audience feels like they really, really do know me. And then I'll meet people and I'll have to remind people, well, you definitely know parts of me, but, to actually know someone is a much more, we can forget that too. We can forget that, oh, no. Even podcasts aren't enough to replace spending a lot of quality time looking into someone's eyes.
Well, speaking of actually looking at people, you have this Ferndale event coming on August 15th. Let's talk about it for a second, because I'll tell you, the Magic Bag is a great venue. It's one of my favorites in downtown Ferndale. I like it because it's big enough to have a crowd, but small enough to be kind of intimate. And so what's so special for you coming to Metro Detroit? This is obviously not your first time in town, but you keep coming back for some reason. Is it the Cafe? It must be the Cafe.
I'll tell you, I don't think we've ever had a bad show in Detroit. I mean, we have had really memorable, and the Magic Bag, there is something about that venue that is just such a comfy fit for us. Like, there have been a lot of very memorable stories that have been shared there. Satori Shakur just brought the house down. There was a story that a young lady shared the last time we were in town about dealing with her boyfriend's alcoholism that was so surprising and so different than most of those kinds of stories I've ever heard before. So we've also had like outrageously hilarious stories that have been shared there in Ferndale before, right there at the Magic Bag. I think Shannon Kaysen once shared like an incredibly crazy like polyamory story there about, how he and his wife like kind of figured out that maybe they were not polyamorous.
Shannon's a great guy too. I've had the occasion to meet him a couple times. What a great dude.
Yeah. So no, we have a lot of great memories of doing shows there in the past. We have not yet cast the show for, August 15th, but we're looking at those pitches right now and it's very exciting.
Well, I can tell listeners that I for sure am getting my ticket because there's no way I would miss this one. And I believe they're $20 ahead of time?
Yep.
Where can folks get those online?
At risk-show.com/tour or, risk-show.com/tour.
Awesome. Well, Kevin, thank you so much for the chat. I really appreciate you. And it's really been an honor spending this half hour with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is a pleasure.
All right, thanks so much to Kevin Allison for that conversation, and thanks to you for listening. If you want more of these kinds of shows to happen, be sure to support us on Patreon at patreon.com/Daily Detroit. I'm Jer Stays. Take care of each other, and we'll see you around Detroit.
You're listening to the Podcast Detroit Network. Visit www.podcastdetroit.com for more information.